A number of African countries have been sucked into the whirlwind of U.S. President Donald Trump's global trade wars. Lesotho is the hardest hit with 50% tariffs on its exports to the U.S. Other African countries face tariffs ranging from 10% to 47%. The U.S. administration has announced a 90-day pause before the tariffs take effect. However, it is still unclear where the taxation leaves U.S. Africa trade. So this week on the program, we examine what these exorbitant tariffs mean for African economies, the future of Africa's trade, and why the continent should present a unified front in tackling the crisis. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in a move likely to upend global trade, Trump's steep tariffs are sending shockwaves across economies worldwide. Over 40 African countries that trade with the U.S. are affected. My colleague Enoch Sikolia gives us a breakdown of the tariffs.
Reciprocal taxes are a trade measure where a country imposes duties on imports equal to those its own exports face abroad. The U.S. claims countries charge higher tariffs on American goods than the U.S. charges on theirs. Trump's latest tariffs, ranging from 10 to 49%, aim to level the playing field, targeting countries that charge higher taxes on U.S. goods. With the European Union already declaring Trump's move a major blow to the world economy, where does Africa come in? From Nigeria to Kenya, South Africa to Egypt, African economies that rely on trade with the U.S. now face new challenges. Countries like Madagascar, Mauritius, Botswana and Lesotho will see tariffs of up to 50%, impacting key industries such as textiles and agriculture. For South Africa, a 30% tariff could spell trouble for its automotive and wine sectors. While the long-term effect may include the breakdown of supply chains established over decades, the more pressing issue is the increased risk of recession for most African countries. Trump's move threatens to destabilize industries that provide thousands of jobs. Many African economies depend on exports to the U.S. under agreements like AGOA. For African businesses, higher tariffs mean lower exports, job losses, and slower economic growth. Some African businesses are already struggling with inflation and supply chain disruptions, and so these tariffs could force some businesses to close. For American consumers, it could mean higher prices for imported African goods. U.S. businesses rely on raw materials from Africa, such as minerals, for tech manufacturing, which could also feel the pinch. As the trade war escalates, African economies brace for an impact. Perhaps some African countries may seek stronger ties with China and Europe.
Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts. In Johannesburg, Amin Idrissa Karama, Senior Director, Africa Union Development Agency, NEPAD. In Abuja, Anthony Bisong, economist and researcher at the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa. And in Mombasa, Kenya, via Zoom, Wangare Muikia, Africa Fiscal Policy Economist and Managing Director, Expertise Global. A very warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us in our discussion. Let me start off with you, Wangare. Now, President Trump has announced a 90-day freeze on the new tariffs, which has been described by some as a strategic pause and by others as a reaction to global market panic. What is your understanding or interpretation of this new twist?
Well, sometimes with what we're seeing with these new developments is you can't really tell what is happening day by day. Right, and so it really destabilizes the global trade. You know, if we don't know whether there's a grand strategy with the U.S. government to, to internalize their trade and to grow their markets by reducing external trade, or fulfilling campaign promises, or what it is, because every day it's something different. So it's very difficult to work in these current conditions. And we're really hoping that the World Trade Organization can come a little bit more strongly to uphold what is happening globally with the trade situation, because it really is untenable at this stage.
So let me come to you, Amin, here, because the U.S. tariffs are targeting some of the poorest countries in Africa, including 32 low-income ones, which have duty-free access to the U.S. markets since 2000 under the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA. Why are tariffs for some African countries low and others are high?
In fact, the disparity came from the methodology that they have used to establish those tariffs. And actually, this methodology that the U.S. administration used shows exactly where we are in terms of trade with the U.S. A country like Lesotho they rely heavily on the export to the U.S., especially export of apparels, but also textile, and their export to the U.S. Through the AGOA represent almost 40% of their GDP, right? But then if you go to some countries, let's go to Mali. Mali actually got 10% of tariff. Mali literally does not export much to the U.S. They import rather actually from the U.S. So the methodology that they have used, which is a methodology based on the trade difference, the trade deficit with one to another country, is what they have used. There is no really a specific economic basis behind that. So Lesotho, basically Madagascar, also South Africa, Mauritius, for instance, are definitely the countries that are going to suffer most from this, regardless of the fact that they were actually part of AGOA and they are taking advantage as well of the AGOA now. There are countries that never actually could take any advantage from AGOA. Take Chad, for instance. Chad last year exported about $82 million to the US. They have imported from the US around 40 million, sorry, something like that. And even what they have exported to the US, though they are a member of AGOA, it did not go through AGOA. In fact, they never took advantage of the AGOA.
Right.
No. So they were paying tariff, and now there is an additional tariff that actually come over and above what they were paying. So it's very hard to say, well, there is a grand strategy behind that with regard to Africa, at least. With regard to Africa, I think that we are just collateral damages of something much bigger going on around.
All right. So, Anthony, if Africa is collateral damage, break it down for us, what you see. What impact will these tariffs have on African economies, particularly those dependent on revenue from U.S. exports like Lesotho, for example? I mean, what do you see as the impact overall?
Least developed countries would definitely be impacted. Lesotho, one of them. And it exports, if you check its trade balance with the US, it recorded a trade surplus. I know that might be a justification going by the methodology for the increase in tariff of over 50% as imposed by the US government. But when you look out for other countries like big trading partners with the US, like Nigeria, 14%, and then South Africa, there's going to affect especially their agricultural exports, that's non-oil exports, even if there are exemptions for oil and then mineral exports. But for agricultural exports in the continent is going to affect them. And we understand that in Africa, we are net exporters of raw materials and raw products. There's no value addition to our product. So it's really going to hit hard. But the good news is, the market is actually open. There are always need for export diversification and then opportunity to look out for other markets. But in the interim, we have the dispute settlement, just like the chairperson of the WTO have called for calm and then called for countries to dialogue and negotiate. It's going to hit hard on Africa, going by the already existing agreement with regards to the trade agreement between US and Africa, the AGOA. But like I said, we look forward to a more systemic and then stability in the system, where at least countries would sit, renegotiate the agreement and then push forward to a more united front, a more multilateral form where at least the small countries, least developed countries would have an opportunity to leverage on what they have and then what can really grow their economy.
So this is expected to hit hard on Africa, Wangara. So which sectors do you think are going to be most vulnerable in the face of these tariffs? And what does this mean for jobs and livelihoods, for example, across the continent? Or is it minimal?
No, it's quite interesting to me. And just to piggyback on Anthony's point, a lot of raw materials is what we export to the US. So we're really wondering about the long game, because a lot of the goods and services that are produced in the US rely on the raw materials coming from the continent. So if they're going to impose tariffs as high as 50%, that means their own goods and services are going to become more expensive in the short run, short to medium term. And if you think maybe they're playing a long-term game, right? To build a textile industry, to build new supply chains for all these raw materials, it's going to take a really long time. And so it's not quite clear, the disruption in the global supply chains, where they're going to get the raw materials from, and how that's going to play out. But on our economies, it's also going to wreak havoc, and not only just the local economy, it's also the economy in the U.S., because labor costs in the U.S. are quite expensive. So you're going to have a textile industry in the U.S. You have to really think about what is going to happen, who's going to be doing, how are they going to be paid, how is the labor going to be paid for, and that means they may move to automation. If industry moves to automation, that means a lot of Americans lose jobs. On the African side, if the industries are decimated, if the textile industry, for example, or other industries in Africa are not exporting anymore, then people lose jobs, right? And they have to think about, diversifying it, and that also takes a long time. So short to medium term is going to hurt, not only for developing countries, but also for the U.S.
All right. I want to look back briefly, because you did talk quite a bit about exactly how Africa is trading with the United States. But let's look back to the last decade. How would you characterize U.S. Africa trade overall?
Actually, there are two dimensions in the U.S. Africa trade. The first one is the volume itself. If you look at actually the volume is quite low. It's overall about 80 billion, and that's actually the max in terms of trade exchange. And then what we are exporting to the U.S. most of the time, I think Wangari put it very well, is raw materials and a little bit of textile. So if actually it's a little bit of textile, let's put it like that, can really the U.S. start making textile in America? I don't think that would happen. If you look at actually, let me just give you an example. Take the price of a blue jean, the jean, that actually everyone used during the last 40 years, the price have not really changed. Despite the inflation, you still actually see jeans sold in the U.S. for about $25 to $30, which is actually the price about 30, 40 years ago. It did not change. Why it did not change? Because basically, what the U.S. does is to use actually the dollars in a way to keep the prices quite low for them. And that's quite interesting. And if they start actually making gin themselves, the price of the gin may go up to $200 to $300. So I don't think that those kind of industry would be relocated really in the U.S. Now, on the other hand, if you look at actually Africa-U.S. trade, U.S. export a lot of service to Africa. So in fact, if we add the cost, what we are spending actually to buy services from the U.S. and then what we put actually to buy as well some technology from the U.S. I think the U.S. is actually taking more advantage from us, and the trade deficit may be on the other side. It's just because when we talk about trade deficit, we most of the time talk about goods and not necessarily about service.
Right. So I want to proceed on that note of exactly how we are trading with the U.S. Anthony, in 2023, two-way trade under AGOA totaled about $47.5 billion, with the U.S. exporting about $18.2 billion US dollars worth of goods and imports amounting to some $29.3 billion. But now we are seeing a potential clash between Trump's executive tariff orders and the long-standing AGOA framework. So which exactly takes precedence? Can the two systems coexist?
Trump tariff at the moment takes precedence, because for me, since AGOA was established on the free duty entry of exports from Africa to the US, so the tariff takes precedence, and it's more expensive to export now to the US. So at this point, it's really a call for concern, going by given that there's already an existing agreement, trade relationship between the US and Africa. But at the moment, as it stands now, the tariff takes precedence, because for countries, most of the countries who are beneficiaries of the AGOA, they were mentioned among those countries, and the imposition cuts across from Nigeria to Angola to South Africa, to Lesotho, Madagascar. They're all listed in the tariff imposition by Trump. So for now, the tariff takes precedence over the AGOA's duty-free exports from Africa to America. Maybe until there is a renegotiation, until maybe African leaders or maybe countries in Africa renegotiate the trade relationship between the US and Africa. What now stands is the tariff as imposed by the administration.
All right, on that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we'll explore the opportunities the Trump tariff crisis presents for Africa and what the future of the continent's trade may look like. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa, and let's continue with our discussion today. Still with me, Amin Idrissa Karama, Anthony Bisong, and Wangari Muika. Let me start off with you, Amin, here, because there has been varied reaction around the world on the tariffs issue. How should African leaders use the 90-day tariff amnesty window? Will negotiations work?
There is an opportunity to renegotiate. Not necessarily about the tariff, but to think ahead, especially about AGOA. Remember, AGOA is coming for reauthorization this year in September. And with what we have seen, where we see that actually the Trump's tariff are taking somehow precedence to AGOA, and because we are moving actually toward the renegotiation of the reauthorization of the AGOA, the 90 days actually could be utilized properly toward that. That's number one. But number two, we should not just actually think about what the US wants to do. We should as well take this time with the African Union to really think through how we can accelerate the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, number one, but how we can actually start thinking as well about the most appropriate way and the most effective way to invest more into our own regional integration and our own industrialization. And this is actually critical. So the 90 days of the pause is not just for us to think about what we're going to do with the US, but it must be actually utilized about what we're going to do ourselves for ourselves, and then toward as well our other partners, such as China and then Europe and some other Asian countries.
Right. So, Wangari, if African countries were to negotiate with the United States over the tariffs issue, what kind of leverage would the continent have in renegotiating any trade terms with the United States?
What we need to do, and as Amin said, is we really need to come together. We have already, so we have regional blocks. And we already have those in place, and many have been in existence for a long time. So why don't we think about that? Think about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Start putting our heads together. I mean, many people are saying, in the short term, yes, we should renegotiate with the US, and then potentially look at strengthening our trade partnerships with Asia and with the UAE and with Europe, and that's fine. But really, we need to start thinking long term. We need to start thinking internally. We need to start taking back our power. From the US, there was a lot of soft power, but now I would almost call it angry power, right? So, and it's becoming really detrimental for us, and we are always on the back foot. We have a lot of strength. We have a lot of minerals. We have a lot of what the world needs. We just need to come together, and we need to be able to put our heads together and come forth with something that's strong and something that represents our power as Africans going forward.
Right. So, Anthony, as we look at options and alternatives for the continent, could these escalating trade tensions, even with that 90-day pause, could that push African countries to pivot more towards other global partners like China and the global South?
No, definitely. We understand that China is the largest trading partner with Africa, with over $300 billion US. So it's really important. We already traded with China, but like I said, we really need to do more. I know my colleagues talked about, trying to push for regional integration. It is really important. But first of all, at the regional level, we need to harmonize our trade policy from ECOWAS to Eastern African countries, and then to South Africa Development Community. So then back to this, it is really, really important. It is really important for the continent, first of all, to really sit back and then look out for diversify their exports, their market for their exports, take advantage of also the EU market, of which we have good trade relationships, and then other countries, in the world. We also have India. We need to look out for partners that are ready to, first of all, accommodate our peculiarities and not take advantage of our vulnerabilities, because we are exporting raw materials, we can just sit somewhere and then decide to slam tariffs on the continent. Okay.
Right. And in looking at that alternative, I mean, I want to get your opinion here. What options are realistically on the table for African nations, following that tariff crisis?
I would like just to add something on what Anthony have said. It's not just about harmonizing our trade regulations and policies. That one is already ongoing, especially through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But there is more pressing issues as well. And here is mostly the issue of standards and norms. Those ones are not really yet harmonized, though you have ARSO, which is the Africa regional standard organization that actually we need to put a little bit more on it. That's number one. But then look at last year, China have announced that they are wiping out a tariff for about 30 African countries for about 6,500, I would say, tariff lines. But we are not capable of taking advantage of that. Why? Because it's not that we don't have anything actually to export to China. It is, apart from raw materials, we could actually export manufactured product. We could actually export as well agriculture product. But our agriculture product that we could actually export are not meeting the standards and the norms of the Chinese market. So this is as well an opportunity to start really investing into those, at the regional level, to harmonize them. Take, for instance, we could easily replace U.S. export to China in terms of soybeans, for instance, but we are not capable of doing that. Why? Because we don't produce, apart from South Africa and Nigeria that produce a little bit of soybeans, and even that, we are not meeting the requirements in terms of standards and norms. Beef as well, pork as well, but we are not meeting the requirements to really, to meet actually the requirements from the Chinese market. So there is an opportunity here for us, but there's mostly an opportunity for us to increase our capacity, in terms of standard and norms at the regional level, but also at the national level.
Right. So looking at that, I mean, in terms of increasing our opportunity on the continent, because there is opportunity for African trade through the African Free Trade Agreement. Can this be the moment to reassess trade dependencies and strengthen intra-Africa trade under Africa CFTA?
This is an opportunity for us, of course, to accelerate our regional integration. And I have said that from the beginning. If you look at actually our, let's say, intra-regional trade between West Africa and Central Africa region, represent less than 10% actually of the respective trade. And this is a shame, right? Now, there are many barriers. We are talking mostly about tariff barriers, but when even we remove tariff barriers, you have a lot of non-tariff barriers that are there. And there is a lot of work that actually the two regions must be doing, especially through ACFTA, with ACFTA Secretariat, but also among their own countries. But then over and above that, there is also the need to invest into regional transport, regional infrastructures, because today, let's say we have agriculture products that we can trade among our regions, but you don't have the transport infrastructures to be capable of moving goods from one region to another. And beside that, we still have non-tariff barriers that are there. Let's say police barrier, hygiene barriers, security barriers, regulatory barriers, that must be harmonized, as Anthony have said. While we are saying that we need to increase intra-African trade, and this is something that we must aim to, we still need to export outside Africa. Why? Because we need foreign currency. We need actually hard currency, unfortunately. Our monetary, our currencies are not that strong, to allow us to import, especially technology, manufactured products, medicines, and to be capable of doing that, we still need dollars, we still need euro, we still need renminbi. So while we are going to work on strengthening our intra-African trade, we still need to invest into increasing our capability to be able to export outside Africa, so we can actually get foreign currency that will help us somehow to meet as well our demand, our internal demand in terms of technology. This is extremely important.
So Wangari, on that note though, what practical steps would be needed here now to maximize the potential and reduce Africa's vulnerability to shocks?
We really need to start fixing ourselves from within, so that we can have the right policies in place to be able to be strong trading partners. Look at the examples of in Ghana, where they have now value addition for their cocoa. Look at Ethiopia, they have some industrial parks to ensure that they have strong industry and manufacturing. I think we need to do the work from within, start building from within, with a look to ensuring that we have strong industry that provides value addition, that provides export-grade goods and services around Africa and also internationally, to Amin's point. I also think that, working together, right? So not only working on our own industrial policies and manufacturing capabilities, but looking for comparative advantage. If I give you an example, just a random example, you look at Kenya's very strong infrastructure.
Right.
You go to Ethiopia, very low labor costs. They have very low power costs. You look at Lesotho, for example, very high efficiency. And if you put all these things together, you can be able to have a very strong case and very strong products that fit global standards and also local Africa. We also have to have our own local African standards. And if we're able to work on ourselves now and create these policies and frameworks and build a policy within, but also work together with other African countries, we have all the inputs. We have great youth. Unfortunately, we are exporting our youth through immigration and sending them to other countries. We have great raw materials, but we're not using them in-house. And all the foundational principles are there. We just need to take it to the next level.
Right. Anthony, I want to get your view here as well.
There's so much ongoing with the AfCFTA. I know my colleague talked about currency issues. There's this Pan-African payment settlement system, the PAPS. African leaders need to make efforts to make sure it's operational, and then exporters start leveraging on that. And then we talked about there's need to push to boost enhance intra-African trade. Really have not leveraged on that. In 2023, data shows that we only recorded a 3.2% increase in intra-African trade. We really need to do more. We really need to move from the current 15 to 16% to about 25, 30%. Now, before we go into the global value chain, we need to develop regional value chain across all RECs, regional economic communities in Africa. It is important that African leaders come together to ensure mineral beneficiation. So it's not by exporting them in their raw form. We need to add value to them and make sure transform most of our products to those things that are exportable, the things we are importing. Unfortunately, we export this in the raw form and then import them as finished goods. No, it's not. So Africans, we really need to look inward, take advantage of the AfCFTA. Like I said, the AfCFTA is a game changer for the continent.
And Wangari, let me come to you with a final question. How can African countries protect their interests now and in the future as global trade policies shift?
One, we need to diversify our economies. Many of the African countries, small countries, are very reliant on one trading partner. The example of Lesotho is evident. So we need to use our natural resources and develop our value addition manufacturing strength. If we have strong leaders that are interested in the development and economic growth of a broader base of the population, then I think we can come to the table strong. We can be able to see the advantages of uniting and come as a unified voice to the world so that we can be a trade partner to reckon with.
Indeed. Thank you all very much. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guest, Amin Idrissa Karama, Senior Director, African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. Anthony Bisong, economist and researcher at the Center for the Study of Economies in Africa, and Wangari Muikia, Africa Fiscal Policy Economist and Managing Director, Expertise Global. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more at Talk Africa. from me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.